Hello and welcome to the Mission Manhood podcast. Today my guest is Ed Nissen. Hi, Ed.
Hey, thanks for having me. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing really well. I reached out to you originally because you had posted something that I thought was really interesting, and we'll get into that in a minute. I wondered if you could just sort of introduce yourself to people and let them know about your work.
Yeah, sure. Again, my name is Ed Nissen, and I'm actually a therapist, and I have a practice in the Charlotte, North Carolina area. I'm originally from Mississippi, and I started my practice about 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that I was going to specialize in personality disorders, and I'm still loosely interested in that. But it's funny how life takes you on twists and turns
Yeah.
uh, that are difficult to anticipate. I guess the particular twists and turns that I'm talking about have led me to where I'm now and what I'm doing now. Really, what began as a personal transformation as a man in my own marriage sort of permeated over into the work that I do as a therapist. The brief story is I had a lot of potential as a husband, but I had a lot of shortcomings too, and there became this time where it was made very apparent to me, and I had a some soul searching to do
Yeah.
and so I began working on that and did a ton of work, read a lot, just a lot of personal work, read a lot of stories, communicated with people who were also on similar journeys with similar experiences. And then I began to see some of these same patterns with a lot of the men that I work with professionally in my therapy practice. And so what happened is that I got really curious about how to apply some of the things that I was applying personally, but
Mm-hmm.
making sure that number one, that they were ethical, because I operate under ethical guidelines,
Yes.
and make sure that they were supported by evidence-based science. I really just, that forced me, I guess you could say, is that it forced me to really make sure that I had a sound grasp on that process. And that experience brought me to where I am now. And that's the long story made short, but
Mm-hmm.
it just took me down a lot of paths with different perspectives.
Yeah.
And I've been able to collectively grasp a lot of perspectives that's really put me in a unique position to understand some things that I guess the average guy doesn't.
I think that's really interesting that you said that, because when I look at your account and when I know a little bit about your background, you seem in some ways like a traditional man's man. You and your wife, this is just things I've gleaned from your Instagram account. You seem to have more traditional roles, like she's really feminine, a feminine woman, and you're a masculine man, and you seem to value that in your relationship. And on the other hand, I just interviewed Ian McKenzie. He has a podcast called the Mythic Masculine. And I see a lot of that in your writing. Like you've got sort of a grasp of the deeper spiritual side of the work between the energy of the masculine and feminine. And so I think that's why I've really been drawn to your work, because you sort of embrace both. You appeal to that more traditional man's man, but you also have a grasp of this deeper spiritual side of it as well. Does that resound with you at all?
It absolutely does. And you mentioned the word mythic. And one of those perspectives that I was talking about earlier is the perspective taken through mythology and just really trying to understand that. And for me, what I mean by that is stories. And I said earlier, when I started to make this personal transformation as a husband in my own marriage, some of the work that I began to do was listen to other people's stories. And so once I started understanding the feminine, masculine dynamics of relationships and really just being a better person overall within the world, that brought me to a lot of mythology. and as a way of understanding those dynamics. And that's what mythology is in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. There's stories, and so that's it's a huge influence on not only my work but really just how I live and experience the world.
I think that I'm drawn to the four archetypes of mature masculinity, the king, warrior, magician, and lover, for the same reason. It's sort of based on mythology or stories. But I know I've seen you mention Jordan Peterson before. He explains the archetypes as it's almost like we're trying to explain the ideal, and you set the ideal out there. And so people are naturally drawn to the ideal. And so it becomes more of a biological reality as people continue to choose the ideal. So it's more than a story, but at the same time, it's hard for people to kind of grasp the significance of the archetypes and the mythology. And
Yeah, I think one way that might be helpful to look at that, and it's certainly helpful for me, is this idea of activation processes.
mm-hmm,
And so a lot of my work, and I guess just the way that I personally live my life, and um, the way that I try to be a husband, not just a husband, a good husband, is that it's through understanding those experiences that activate particular unconscious processes. And you could say that those four archetypes, the king, warrior, magician, lover, are some of those unconscious aspects that are activated. And so the stories to me serve as, I don't know where, so I haven't really been able to articulate this as well as I want to, but it seems like those stories that we're talking about tend to play a part in activating the maturation process of those archetypes, if you will. And maybe some people, some guys more naturally and more easily activate particular
mm-hmm.
archetypes of those four better than others. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And I agree with you. I think that of the four, when I'm working with people, it's almost like they generally are really great at one. They really get that, or maybe two. And then there's one or two that don't resound as well, and they have to study those more. I don't know if you found that in your practice as well. Almost like
Yeah, I
you're
agree with
gifted.
that.
Yeah. So some are more natural than others. Like some people are really great with the vision of the king. They might not really get the lover so much, but a lot of men are really comfortable with and resound well with the warrior. But maybe the magician is kind of out of their grasp. They don't really quite get that. That kind of leads into why I was so drawn to the post that you had. And if anyone wants to look at your account, this was posted on June the 6th. I thought I would just read the first part of it and then maybe get some of your thought process about it.
Okay.
It says, as a feminine woman, my wife has her way of processing life experiences. Responding to her with my emotional distress and acting irrationally impedes her healing and growth. I must consider what character I need to display in response to her emotional experiences. My character is essential in this regard because it asks that I summon my best, which, in turn, brings out my most profound qualities. Tell me a little bit about what that means to you.
Yeah, there can be a lot to unpack there, and I'll try to be concise and clear with that. I think that there are so many variables that factor into any sort of interaction in which not just conflict, but the potential for something better, the potential for growth, the potential for healing. How I like to look at that is the potential for intimacy and harmony. And maybe this is sort of where some of that magician archetype comes in, because there is a sense of intuition perhaps that comes with that. And so it's
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, what is the greater good here? Which direction does this interaction need to go? Now that's more of an abstract, almost existential level, but you can look at that by just observing behaviors. And the better we can understand, say, human behaviors, particularly the behaviors of our partner, but more importantly, why they are behaving that way. And typically, if you just pay attention and you put that attention towards how I need to respond, but regardless of how I respond, I need to show my best character. I need to have the best response, which makes me look at myself in real time. And when I do that, and I'm considering this aim of harmony and intimacy, then it really forces me, forces may not be the wrong word, but what it really
Mhm.
does is actually help narrow me down to the precise response that I need to have. Because I have all of these limitations that say, well, if I do this, then I'm not being my best. If I don't respond in a way that's seeking harmony, then I might only be taking care of myself in this situation, which by default means I'm not tending to her. So
Mhm.
that alone rules out so many other options as far as how I can respond. And so the long story short there is uh, when I seek that with that aim, at that point it becomes easier and easier for me to sort of select my response and where that comes from.
Yeah.
And when I do that, that does bring out those more magnificent qualities of me as a masculine man, channeling that mature masculine within.
Yeah. I just I think the reason this was so appealing to me is because I think the whole aim of, having those 4 quadrants balanced, and if you practice that on a regular basis in the heat of a moment like what you're kind of describing here, something has happened, some stimulus in a microsecond, really deciding how you're going to respond to it. And I think this captures the vision of the king. Like, I know what my vision is for this relationship with this woman, and the discipline of the warrior, where I'm tempted to react in a certain emotional way, I'm going to restrain that. And the knowledge of the magician, like you said. And the fourth thing is, to me, the lover has this sense of duty. He knows how to be in the situation, and he understands what the situation calls for. I just think that in that tiny little post, you sort of described that balance between the 4 quadrants really well.
And I know I said earlier that there's a lot that you can unpack with this. And one of the best ways that I've come up with in understanding this is sort of it's an analogy of a barometer. And a
Mhm.
barometer is any instrument that measures, well, primarily we know that as measuring atmospheric pressure, but it's also an instrument, or it's a way to reflect changes in circumstances or opinions. And this is interesting to me because one way that I look at the feminine is that it sort of serves as a barometer that reflects changes with me, especially in
Mhm.
regards to whether or not I'm moving towards my potential. And I can observe that in real time with, say, my wife's behaviors towards me in our interactions together. Okay. And what I mean by that is that if I'm moving towards my potential, then I experience a certain kind of love and appreciation with her. And if I'm moving away from my potential as a masculine man, I experience a certain kind of challenge and tension with her.
Mhm.
And that's something that I've come to make principle as far as what I consider in our interactions and how I can be my best. And so what happens there is that based on those observations, I can, with some relative ease, look at myself and say, okay, maybe the way that this interaction is going is reflecting my movement away from being my best, because there's some tension there. It's challenging to tend to her, to get through to her heart, so to speak. And so when I pay attention to that, then I can adjust my responses with that. But I think that if you were to take that train of thought, anyone could begin to relate with that. What happens is that this says two things. One thing that it says that I really like is that the key to my wife's success in our relationship, our marriage, is to value herself enough to not settle for anything less than me giving her my most magnificent self. I can look at these challenging behaviors, these challenging interactions, because let's face it, as men, it's really hard to look at our partner's behavior and not just think it's irrational and psychotic sometimes. And it's a shallow view if we don't really understand what we're contending with. But what that's saying is, like, no, she wants our best, and she's going to demand that. And
Yeah.
depending on how you look at that, that means she believes in you, and that's promising. That's a beautiful thing to me. So the key to my success in that, in my marriage, based on that idea, is to respond to those challenges with my most magnificent self.
I think that one of the things that creates a successful relationship is a man being open to her influence. And I think that's what you were kind of describing.
Mm-hmm.
When you encounter some sort of tension or whatever it is, you're curious. You're not resentful. And I think that curiosity and that allowing and that open to what it is that you're seeing right now or feeling, then you become sort of a problem solver. And based on what else is going on, you understand how to deal with it. And I have this idea that it's kind of a man's job in a family or a relationship is to be sort of a shapeshifter. You can read the room, so to speak. There's a verse in the Bible about the woman being the weaker vessel. And I think some of that has to do with that unbridled emotion. And so if you have that man who's able to hold his frame and hold steady in the midst of that chaos, it allows her to then process and in turn be really grateful to you for helping her regulate and get grounded. I don't know if that's been your experience.
And I think that's been my precise experience, and I think that's the precise experience of any man who has been able to uh, develop and mature his masculine side, so to speak. And they may not articulate it that way, but I think that if you look at men who do that, uh, you could easily describe it that way. And if you were to talk to them, they would say, "Oh yeah, that is. I've never heard it that way, but yeah, that is exactly what's happening." I really appreciate the way that you have sort of clarified and paraphrased a lot of what I'm saying, because it's helpful for me, because you put it in a particular way, and maybe that's sort of your feminine nature, if I will,
Yeah. Yeah,
that's
maybe
able to help
so.
me become more nuanced in that.
I feel like obviously, I have to learn and acquire knowledge just like everybody, but that's more of an exterior thing. To me, that's more in the masculine realm. The way I prefer to understand things is just through meditation and knowing and sort of getting in touch with that deeper true self. And for that reason, when I read things like this post, it's like someone just translated into English what I was feeling in my spirit. And so to me, that's very helpful when I run across that. And sort of that attitude of the buck stops here. Like, I'm the man of this house and I'm responsible for the things that are going on here, even extending to my wife or my daughter, or even my son's emotions. And the other analogy that I had is kind of like an emergency room doctor doing triage. You might go into someone who is screaming and thinks that they're dying, and you might go to the next room and somebody says they're fine, but you realize they're dying. And so they come to the front of the line. And I feel like a man's job in a home especially is to realize what is really an emergency, and then help other people to regulate down and to see the truth. And for the immature man who takes everything personally, they either react in the immature masculine like the high chair tyrant and they push away because they can't
Mm-hmm.
handle it, or they rise up into that more of a tyrant king and force everyone to sort of bow down in a way. So the people aren't really getting their needs met, but they're quiet at least.
I have a list in my phone that I reference often, and this list is basically a two-part list. One is displays of high value and displays of low value.
Mm-hmm.
And the goal is to do more of the high value and less of the low value. Um, so as you were talking, I recalled that list, and one of the things on that list is to love my wife and child enough to
Mm-hmm.
teach them. And I put it that way because not to say that it's necessarily my job to teach them everything. And it's certainly not saying that they can't learn things on their own or that they don't know things. But if I see the need for that and it's not happening, I have a responsibility at that time to intervene, to step in with love, of course, and teach, to lead, to guide in that respect.
It reminds me of a tool that I try to help people with. It's transactional analysis. Eric Byrne is the man who came up with this, but just very simply, he says that in relationships with others, we have three different ego states. We have a parental, an adult, and a child. And when we're in a relationship with another adult, say your wife, ideally, most of our interactions are adult to adult without a lot of emotion. But in these times, like your teaching moments, when maybe your wife has risen up and she's becoming more of the mother and looking down on you as a child, instead of taking that and responding as a child, you maintain your adult ego state and you invite her to come back down. This is not in keeping with my vision. So in a way, you're correcting and allowing her to come back to her true self instead of demonizing her behavior. There's a song by, I think it's Dierks Bentley. He says, mean enough to stare your demons down. And I think that's an ultimate response of love, is when somebody is acting in bad behavior, to extend that grace to them and invite them to come back to what our vision is for our relationship.
First of all, I wholeheartedly agree with what you say there. I think one of the things that it speaks to, just, and maybe I'm saying this just as a man, is that it kind of comes back down to that frame, that maintaining, holding that strong, robust frame, because I think that's what keeps us consistent. And so to me, the way that, and frame is a concept that you could really unpack. But I would say that the more robust your frame control, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
is that more that you can see the layers to things happening. And so instead of, like what you said earlier, taking it personally, you can see what's happening here. And I think that is sort of that magician, that mature magician archetype there, that, okay, I can see all of these moving parts. I can see the fluidity of them. I can see what's static. I can see what's dynamic. And it's almost like if you've ever seen the movie Minority Report, where he's got this sort of holographic screen and he's moving items around.
Mm-hmm.
And those who have seen that will get that analogy, but it's sort of just this very visual thing, but seeing layers that aren't physically there, so to speak. And
Yeah.
so seeing the function behind the behaviors and the interactions and things like that. That if you simply educate yourself somewhat and just seek to improve yourself and to be mindful of those things, it's pretty amazing what one could do with that. But I think a lot of that is that recognition, which requires paying attention and being mindful.
And I think, just to wrap up that transactional analysis, that parent ego state, the adult ego state, the child, all of them are acceptable in a loving relationship. It's just, not getting caught. Sometimes it's okay to be a vulnerable child with your partner. Sometimes you
Mm-hmm.
need that, to allow that. And then sometimes it's okay to rise up in more of a parental ego state if your partner needs to be cared for or needs that direction or correction, as you were saying earlier. And to allow that flow in a relationship is, I think, what really leads to intimacy. I wanted to read the second part of your post.
Okay.
When this occurs in relation to my feminine partner, I experience love, appreciation, and adoration from her. She wants to reciprocate my quest for excellence by bringing her best and giving it all to me. This is not to seek approval from me, it is to show me she is mine. As I strive to be the prize, she will also want to be the prize. I just thought that was a really beautiful way to express what happens over time in a mature relationship when people are both trying.
Obviously, this is a meaningful thing to say from my standpoint. Several things come to mind, but one of them is, and I think we started to, or you started to allude to that earlier, but it's sort of this feminine creative potential, this emotional experience that she just wants to express and to live fully in that. And but if there's no container to have that experience, she never gets to fulfill that. She, in a way, it's like you might say that she doesn't get to fulfill her feminine purpose, so to speak. And so there's a lot of behaviors on the masculine end, a lot of responses on the masculine side of things that not only brings that, I don't know, I'd say that maybe the more destructive side of chaos, but it creates a container for her to be able to live out her creative expression, regardless of the emotion. And it can be, one of the so-called negative emotions, but nonetheless, it's still a very creative process that has to happen there for her to feel fulfilled, to heal, to grow, to for both of us to have that harmony and intimacy. And so this is where some of that, and it's very confident to say that part of this is to show me that she is mine, as I strive to be the prize. But that confidence creates a solid foundation, a solid container for her to be able to step into and to have her feminine emotional world realized. And that's part of the process, just from my perspective here. And so that's what that reciprocation is. That to me is like, okay, this is a container worthy of my feminine. And this is why I will give him all that I am, all to him, and that I will also want to be the prize, that reciprocity with love and appreciation and adoration.
A lot of times when I'm reading your post, it reminds me of the movie, The Black Panther. I don't know if you saw that movie, but
Mm-hmm.
there was a warrior woman, and I don't know her name right off the bat, but she demanded so much from the king who she defended, and then also her husband, who was also a warrior. And she turned her back on the king for the sake of the kingdom. And then at the end of the movie, in all of her fierceness, that rhinoceros with all the armor was coming toward her and just stopped. And then in that moment, she was just the sweetest, most fragile, feminine woman. It was just a
Yeah.
sweet moment. And I feel like the battle is so worth it because in the end, that becomes yours. That is yours.
I would say it's glorious. And it's sort of that union of mature masculine and mature feminine power. That scene, this character in the Black Panther movie you described that to me is a pretty accurate reflection of how to me the wise, mature, feminine can be, what they can do, the power that they can have, and the influence that they can have over a whole kingdom. It just looks different. I would say more obscure, so it's probably harder to detect. Depending on what psychology you look at, too, you could say that the feminine represents chaos. It's obscure. It represents the unconscious, and so that means it's hard to understand. And the opposite would be the masculine. So I think that that sort of contributes to a lot of the misperceptions and misunderstandings of the feminine. part of the work that I'm doing is to, number one, make sure that I'm as clear as I can be on what all of that really is and how that, the understanding of all of that is, but also to sort of spread the good word, so to speak. And it's proven to be useful for a lot of people. I get a lot of good feedback. I get some pushback too. I take some hits
Yeah.
with some of the things I say. I kind of expected to take some hits from the part in that post where I said, that this is not to seek approval from me. It's to show me that she is mine. So just little things like that. Some people, if they have an undifferentiated view on these things, then they would take something like that as arrogant. But obviously, if you look at it and you understand those dynamics, you can see the power and strength and intimacy and harmony that can come from that.
Yeah. This reminded me of Psalm 91. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, you are my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I will trust. And I think that in an intimate relationship, both partners can take on these characteristics that are described in, say, the Psalms. And for a woman to have that respite place that she knows that this man is strong enough to handle all that she is, it's that secret place of the Most High, her Lord, that intimate relationship. It's not every man, it's that one specific. And I think that's such a beautiful thing that two people can create. And I think that's what you were sort of describing. You're giving her a resting place, a soft place to land from the world.
That's one way that I present that to a lot of the men that I work with. And I'm speaking to when you said providing that soft landing place. A couple of things that all of that makes me think of is, one, that man has to be worthy of even being able to enter that sacred place. And so what constitutes being worthy to enter into that same place, into that sacred place? That is where a lot of my work comes in. Okay, well, what do those literal behaviors look like? And this, I'm talking about basic assertive communication skills. I'm talking about like building confidence, maintaining frame control, taking an inventory of your character. These are all sort of basic level things. But those basic level things, when done properly to any degree, really begins to activate those processes and produces those experiences, which gives you the evidence. And the experience and the evidence is intimacy and harmony, or at least an alleviation of discord and conflict, which by default means you're moving towards the opposite, which would be intimacy and harmony.
Mm-hmm. It's just a message that's not very prevalent, just for people who may not be able to grasp really what we're talking about. I saw you might have seen it, maybe not. I'm going to post it on my Instagram, but there was a video from the PGA, and these professional golfers were walking down the fairway. One golfer just looked up. He almost stepped on an alligator, and it was right by the pond, and this alligator was just there sunning itself. And he leapt back, and he and his caddy just started running in the opposite direction, which any of us would have done. And the next golfer that came up just looked down and saw it and casually patted it, and the alligator just ran off in the water. To me, I think about every sitcom that we have now. We're conditioning men to run away from the beast, run away from the woman, and it's almost become really culturally acceptable. But in this analogy, the second golfer that came up is like, hey, you've been out too long. Go refresh yourself. Go do whatever. Like, I've got this. I know this is not who you are. I know that, I can handle it. And I can't tell you like how refreshing that is for a woman to be met with that quiet confidence. Like, what are we doing here? This is not my vision for our home, And so, you're as bad as you want to be, like as a woman, and you know that you have somebody who's strong enough to check you. And so it just adds a lot to the relationship to have that space that you were saying, that she's wild and free in her feminine essence. So
It's funny you bring up the story about the golfers and the alligator. In August, we'll be married 12 years in August. So this story that I'm about to tell you took place before we were married, but we were engaged, and we were on this highway in this town in Mississippi, or this city in Mississippi. And long story short, there was an alligator about 4 or 5 foot long crossing this highway.
mhm.
And obviously, that's not really where alligators need to be, not for themselves or for other people, right? Um, so I turn around and eventually what I did is rescue this alligator. I picked it up
You
and
picked it up.
and so we wrapped its jaws shut so it wouldn't bite us. But it was it was a little dangerous. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah.
I don't recommend it. But I've watched enough of what's the crocodile show?
You watched
I felt like I've
yeah,
seen enough of
Alligator
those shows.
Hunters. You watched
Yeah,
enough Alligator Hunters.
right, right. I think I've watched enough of those shows. I think I can do this.
It's hilarious.
Of course, that's 11, 12 years ago, so wasn't quite as mature then. But there's something to be said about a young, sort of courageous, brave, maybe ignorant young man, but just that sort of fierceness. And I remember when I picked this alligator up, and I remember it like it was yesterday. My wife, with the most enthusiasm, said, "I'm marrying that man," like to let everyone around know. And
That's amazing.
she was proud. So that story of the golfers and alligator reminded me of that, and that's a story that comes up from time to time. But
Yeah, just I was gonna say before you even said that, that probably sealed the deal for her when you were willing to get
I
out and
think she would
rescue an
agree to that.
alligator.
I think she would agree with you.
Yeah. Well, just in closing, one other thing that comes up for me when we talk about these things is Psalm 97:5, which says, "The mountains melt like wax before the Lord of all the earth." And when I think about that erratic, crazy feminine energy, sometimes for men it seems like a mountain. But in the presence of that masculine frame, those mountains do melt like wax. A woman, I think, is so relieved to not have to carry the burden, you know.
Mm.
So when she's presented with that mature masculinity, it's just such a relief for her.
That's a beautiful scripture. One of the things that I tell guys a lot, and I think I started to touch on it earlier, was that again, with sort of the stereotypical ways that a guy can look at his feminine partner, is that she's irrational, she's crazy, and too emotional and psychotic. And I say, well, if she's going to be psychotic, then be her padded room, be her soft landing place, And so the aim there is to sort of divert that power back to them. Like, okay, I'm not going to argue with you that she may be all these things, even though I really think it's because you don't understand what you're contending with. But if you do those things, then that gives you a sense of power, that gives you a sense of control as a man, which then activates some of those maturation processes with the masculine. And then what he experiences is a new frame, a new way to look at her, and to say that, okay, well, there is a lot of beauty in that. And I'm so glad that I decided to be her soft landing place, even though I thought she was kind of crazy and too emotional. But then what happens is his beliefs about that began to change, and the subsequent experiences of that began to change. And there's that harmony and intimacy again.
Yeah, and a lot of times I think the thing that was originally feared becomes something that's very appealing for him. That sort of wild and wonderful aspect of her.
Absolutely. It's I really do just think it's a beautiful thing. And a lot of guys have a really hard time understanding and believing that. But really, that's the case with anything, not just relationships, not just the feminine masculine dynamics, but the more we can understand what we're contending with, the easier it is to see the beauty in that, and what a life changer that can be.
Yeah. You know, I have mentioned this to people before and talked about it. It's not original to me, but it takes one person to change the dance. So if you're locked in a dance that's not working for you, one person changing the dance forces the other person to make adjustments. And you might go through a period of we're stepping on each other's toes. We might stop dancing for a minute. We regroup. But if one person decides to change, then it will cause changes in the relationship as well.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I know maybe because I am a man, but from that male perspective, that masculine perspective, I am more keen to how the man can be that influence. But I'm also deeply interested in how the feminine woman can be that change agent, so to speak, to be that influence. And the more that I journey through that feminine world, the more that I think I become nuanced in that. And I think that really is something that that may be a word, in my opinion, that can best describe the magician archetype in myself is nuanced.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I'm the more I hate to say study because it sounds so clinical, but the more I immerse myself in the feminine world, the more nuanced I can be with that. Ultimately, resulting in a better connection with the world, and that's primarily done through my relationship with my wife, who is very much a feminine woman.
Yeah. One thing that I wanted to close with, if you don't mind, I know that in your professional world, you might have had experience with this, so I wanted to give you a chance to say a word about it. I think that men have a lot of pressure on them, and a lot of these men's groups or men's pages speak in absolutes. And so there can potentially be a lot of shame for men who, do everything we're saying and they try and they really can't make any progress. And I do think it's important to address mental illness or abuse for men who find themselves in that situation. Have you ever encountered that in your practice?
All the time. And you're right to bring that up. There are things that can impede your growth, your maturation, and severely so. So I think that maybe some of this gets to the stigma of therapy, where it's like, okay, I think that men should seek therapy and counseling, or even just coaching, just to at least
Yeah.
start activating some healing in their lives. I think some of that is there. I would like to see some changes in our industry as therapists, where more therapists were masculinity friendly, I think you
Yeah.
might say. I'm afraid we don't see a lot of that. That's been a lot of the reports that I've gotten from a lot of the male clients that come to see me, is how refreshing it was to come see someone such as myself, who does understand masculinity the way that I
Yeah.
do, and work in that. So the bottom line is, if you start that process and you're serious about it and you put in the effort and the work, I think you're going to realize what healing needs to take place. And I think the more that we understand that, the easier it is to gravitate towards that.
Yeah. So I would just say for anyone listening, if you feel like you're unable to make changes, maybe you're low or depressed, you might seek out someone like Ed, a coaching session, just to kind of help someone, a professional, help evaluate where you are. But I think the flip side of that too is, even if the man is healthy and ready to make changes, if you're dealing with mental illness with her, or substance abuse or any kind of abuse, sometimes you might need someone to help you evaluate that as well. Your spouse might need some professional help before some real lasting change can take place.
That's a tough one too, but an important and necessary one too. So if you, I agree with you. I think that if, and we know they're out there, we know those people are out there that
Yeah.
they're doing good work as an individual, but they know that their significant others not as healthy as they could be, and if they were, the relationship could be catapulted into the stratosphere. And so, I would
Yeah.
say that there should be an utmost importance placed on that. Mental illness is a real thing, and it can be a dangerous thing. So if that is remotely what's going on, go get help. That would
Yeah.
be my message to close here.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of shame, especially for men, even more so than women, in admitting that you need help or even admitting that you are in an abusive situation. I think that's harder for men to admit. So to your point, if you feel like you're in one of those situations, get the help that you need.
Absolutely. And there are a lot of good guys out there. I know I express some skepticism in our field with people who aren't necessarily keen to masculinity. But there are a lot of good people out there who are. And even if they're not a therapist, there are excellent men's coaches out there that if you just do a little bit of your homework, you'll find that they're pretty reputable and good people.
Yeah. And if anyone needs a recommendation, they can definitely send me a message and you
Yep,
would be
same
willing
here.
to. Yeah.
Absolutely. Please do, really.
All right. Well, Ed, this has been such a great conversation. I really appreciate your work and I appreciate your time coming today and talking to us about these things.
Well, this is fun to me, so I really appreciate the opportunity, and I really like the work that you're doing. I think that it's important, and um, thank you for honoring that call, if you will.
Well, thank you. And I look forward to talking to you again.
Same here. Thank you so much.
Bye.
All right, bye.